Racist cops arrest a black woman. Their faces drop when they learn her husband is the police chief. No one ever thinks that a peaceful evening can turn into a nightmare in just a few short minutes. But for Alicia Carter, that was nothing new. As a civil rights attorney, she had seen too many cases where the color of a person's skin determined how they were treated under the flashing red and blue lights of the police. She had defended victims who were pulled over without cause, who were suspected, who were treated like criminals simply because they didn't fit the biases of those in power. But what she never expected was to become part of that story herself. That night, she was just driving home. Alicia Carter exhaled deeply as she navigated the quiet suburban streets of Charlotte, North Carolina. The weight of the day pressed against her shoulders, but a familiar sense of relief washed over her as she neared home. As a civil rights attorney, she had spent the last 10 hours in a relentless battle for justice, advocating for a black teenager unfairly expelled from school. The case had been exhausting, but it was her passion. Fighting systemic bias, challenging authority when it overstepped, ensuring that the law served everyone, not just those in power. Her black sedan glided smoothly through the streets, moving at a steady 32 miles per hour in a 35 zone. The neighborhood was peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of porch lights. She allowed herself a small smile as she thought about James, her husband, likely already home, unwinding from his own long day. Then, out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights illuminated her rearview mirror, piercing the darkness like a warning siren. Alicia's hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel. She wasn't speeding. No traffic violations. Her registration was up to date. Still, she knew better than to question the reason outright. She signaled and pulled over, parking under a street lamp for visibility. She took a deep breath. She had been here before, not personally, but through her clients, her community, the stories she had defended in court. Stay calm. Keep your hands visible. No sudden movements. 2 officers emerged from the patrol car. One, tall and broad-shouldered, approached with an air of dominance. The other, slightly younger, carried a smirk, his movements casual, but with an undertone of condescension. Alicia rolled down her window, her expression unreadable. The older officer rapped on her window with his flashlight. "License and registration," he ordered without so much as a greeting. Alicia retrieved them smoothly, handing them over without protest. No explanation. No courtesy. "You in a hurry tonight?" the younger officer asked, tilting his head as he peered into the car. Alicia kept her voice level. "Not at all, officer. Just heading home." Blake, the taller of the two, narrowed his eyes. "You swerved back there, looked distracted." Alicia's brows furrowed, but she kept her tone even. "I was driving straight. If there's dashcam footage proving otherwise, I'd be happy to review it." Blake's jaw tightened. He didn't like being challenged. Turner, the younger officer, let out a short chuckle. "Dashcam, huh? Look at that. We got a legal expert here." He glanced over the documents. "No priors. No warrants," he muttered, almost disappointed. Blake leaned slightly closer, shining his flashlight over the car's interior. "You got anything in here we should know about?" Alicia met his gaze without flinching. "Like what?" Blake smirked. "Drugs, weapons? Anything you forgot to mention?" Alicia remained composed. "I'm a lawyer, I know my rights. I'd like to know the real reason you pulled me over." Turner scoffed, exchanging a glance with Blake. "Step out of the vehicle," Blake ordered suddenly. Alicia's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice firm. "On what grounds?" Turner smirked, resisting an investigation. Alicia clenched her jaw. This was escalating faster than she had anticipated. Before she could say another word, Blake yanked open the door. His grip was firm as he grabbed her arm, and she felt the cold metal of handcuffs bite into her wrists. "This is an illegal stop," she said evenly, refusing to let them see even a flicker of fear. Yeah, Turner muttered dismissively. "Tell it to the judge." The squad car door slammed shut behind her, the enclosed space suddenly feeling much smaller than before. As the car rolled forward, she caught sight of a few silhouettes behind house windows, neighbors peeking through blinds but doing nothing. She inhaled deeply, exhaling slowly. They didn't know who she was, and that would be their biggest mistake. Alicia sat stiffly in the back of the patrol car, the cold bite of the handcuffs pressing into her wrists. The quiet hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio were the only sounds filling the space. Blake and Turner sat in the front seats. Their conversation light, almost casual, as if arresting a black woman on flimsy charges was just another routine part of their night. "So, what do you think? Reckless driving, or should we go with resisting?" Turner asked, smirking as he glanced back at Alicia through the rearview mirror. Blake let out a low chuckle. "They always resist, don't they? Always think they're smarter than the badge." Alicia's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Engaging them would only feed their egos. She had seen it before. Officers who thrived on exerting power over those they believed were beneath them. Instead, she focused on controlling her breathing. Panic would do her no good. Her mind raced through the legal options available to her. She could already envision the courtroom, the case she would build against them. The squad car pulled into the precinct, and as the doors unlocked, Blake opened the back door, gripping her arm firmly as he pulled her out. "Let's go, lady." Alicia straightened her posture, stepping out with quiet dignity, refusing to let them see any fear. The fluorescent lights of the precinct cast a sterile, almost unforgiving glow as she was led through the entrance, past a few other officers who barely gave her a second glance. She could feel the weight of their eyes as she walked down the hallway, but no one intervened. Turner guided her into a small holding room. The space was cold and unwelcoming, with metal benches and a barred door. He removed her cuffs with an almost mocking flourish. "Sit tight. We'll figure out what to charge you with soon enough." Blake chuckled. "Or maybe we won't. Maybe we just let you cool off in here for a bit." The two men exchanged smug glances before walking out, the door clanging shut behind them. Alicia exhaled, rolling her wrists, massaging the sore spots where the cuffs had been too tight. She refused to sit. Instead, she stood near the bars, listening to the conversation happening just outside. "She's got a mouth on her," Turner muttered. Blake snorted. "Yeah, but she'll learn. They always do." Alicia's stomach churned with anger, but she forced herself to remain composed. She had spent her career fighting for people who had been through this exact situation. Now, it was happening to her, and she knew the game they were playing. Keep her here long enough to make her sweat. Intimidate her just enough to make her feel powerless, but they didn't realize who they had just arrested. As the minutes dragged into an hour, Alicia leaned against the cool metal of the bars, her patience steady. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, firmer, more purposeful than before. A new voice entered the conversation, one with more authority. "What's this?" The voice was sharp, questioning. Turner's response was lazy. "Reckless driving." "Resisting." Silence followed. Then, a sigh. "And did you review any actual evidence before bringing her in?" Alicia turned slightly, watching as a new figure stepped into view. A senior officer, older, with a hardened expression. His badge read, Lieutenant Harris. Blake shrugged. "Didn't need to." She was acting suspicious. Harris glanced down at the file in his hands, flipping through it quickly. Alicia saw the exact moment his face shifted, his brows furrowing deeply. His grip on the folder tightened slightly, and when he lifted his gaze back to Blake and Turner, there was something unreadable in his expression. "You two stay here," he said abruptly before turning and walking briskly away. Alicia exhaled slowly, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Lieutenant Harris's footsteps were sharp and deliberate as he exited the holding area, his phone already in his hand as he pressed a number with urgency. Alicia didn't need to hear the conversation to know exactly who he was calling, and the moment that call was answered, everything would change. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, but Alicia remained steady. The precinct bustled around her, officers moving through their routines, unaware that a storm was about to hit. Blake and Turner remained by the desk, seemingly unconcerned, still chatting idly as if they had just done their jobs well. Then, the door to the precinct swung open, and the entire atmosphere in the room shifted in an instant. Alicia didn't need to turn around to know who had just walked in. She could feel it. The sheer weight of his presence, the authority in his measured steps, the silence that swallowed the room whole. James Carter had arrived. Her husband, the chief of police of Charlotte, stepped into the room like a force of nature. He was still in full uniform, his posture straight, his face unreadable, but Alicia knew him well enough to recognize the simmering storm beneath his controlled expression. The moment Blake and Turner saw him, their smugness evaporated. Turner's smirk dropped entirely, and Blake, for the first time that night, looked truly uncertain. James stopped in the center of the room, his dark eyes sweeping over the space with slow precision, before locking onto Lieutenant Harris. "Where is she?" His voice wasn't raised, but it carried through the entire room like a command. Harris wasted no time. "Holding cell, sir. James didn't acknowledge him further. He was already moving. Alicia heard the jingle of keys, the quiet click of the lock, and then her cell door swung open. She turned, meeting James's eyes, and for a moment, the tension cracked just slightly. His gaze softened for just a fraction of a second, a silent exchange of understanding between them. Then, his attention snapped back to the officers who had arrested her. James stepped out of the holding area, his presence looming as he faced Blake and Turner directly. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them could. His voice was measured, quiet, but laced with something heavy and dangerous. "I want to see the arrest footage." The room was silent. No one moved. I said, "Now." Lieutenant Harris moved first, grabbing the nearest monitor and pulling up the body cam footage. The officers in the precinct gathered closer, drawn to the unfolding moment, understanding now that this was not going to be brushed aside. The footage played. The silence that followed was deafening. There was no reckless driving, no resisting, no aggression, only two officers escalating a situation for no reason other than their own prejudice. James watched the screen with an expression so still it was almost unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned back to Blake and Turner. "You're suspended, effective immediately." Blake opened his mouth, but James cut him off with a single look. "If you think for a second that I'll tolerate this kind of behavior in my department, you are sorely mistaken." His voice was quiet, yet it filled every corner of the precinct. "You will not disgrace this badge any longer." Turner looked stunned, his mouth slightly agape, as if he hadn't actually believed there would be consequences. Blake's hands curled into fists at his sides. But he knew better than to speak, now. James's gaze swept across the room, ensuring that every officer present understood what had just happened. "If any of you think that abusing your authority will go unnoticed, take a good look at them." His voice darkened. "Because this is your only warning." The weight of his words settled over the precinct like a final verdict. Blake and Turner stood frozen, their faces pale, their world crumbling in front of them. Alicia exhaled, stepping out of the cell completely, adjusting her posture as James turned back to her. She offered him a small, knowing smile. "Took you long enough," he sighed, shaking his head before glancing back at the stunned precinct. "Let's go." As they walked out together, Alicia could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a statement. And for every officer watching, the message was crystal clear. Accountability had arrived. James Carter walked beside his wife, his steps slow but deliberate as they exited the precinct. Alicia matched his stride, her back straight, her expression composed, though he could sense the restrained anger just beneath the surface. The cold night air wrapped around them as they stepped outside, but neither of them shivered. The weight of what had just happened inside that building had left them numb to the chill. James opened the passenger door of his car for Alicia, watching as she slid in, her movements still tight with tension. He shut the door, walked around, and got behind the wheel. He didn't start the car immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Alicia turned slightly, watching him. "I'm fine," she said, her voice measured. James exhaled through his nose, finally turning to her. His gaze searched hers, not for weakness but for any sign that she was holding something back. "I should have been there sooner." She let out a quiet, almost bitter laugh. "Sooner? James, they had me in there for hours before someone bothered to check who I was." James clenched his jaw. "That's not the point. The point is, they had no right to stop you in the first place. They were looking for an excuse, and when they couldn't find one, they made one." Alicia's fingers drummed against her thigh. "And how many other people do they do this to? People who don't have a police chief for a husband?" James didn't answer right away. He knew the answer. He had spent his entire career in law enforcement trying to root out officers like Blake and Turner. Officers who saw the badge as a weapon, a shield to hide behind rather than a responsibility to uphold. But even as police chief, he couldn't catch them all. "I'm not letting this go," he finally said, turning the key in the ignition. "Not this time." Alicia didn't argue. She knew he meant it. The drive home was silent. Neither of them needed to say anything else. The storm had passed for now, but another was already forming on the horizon. The next morning, James arrived at his office earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, casting a muted glow over the city as he walked into police headquarters. His expression unreadable. His assistant, Anita, looked up from her desk, startled. "Chief Carter, get me everything on officers Blake and Turner," James said, his voice clipped, his tone leaving no room for questions. Anita nodded quickly, already pulling up the files. James walked into his office, closing the door behind him. He sat at his desk, staring at the framed photo of Alicia on the shelf. His fists clenched. Minutes later, Anita walked in, setting a folder on his desk. "Everything you asked for. Complaints, incident reports, anything flagged under their names." James flipped it open. His stomach twisted as he scanned the pages. Excessive force complaints, multiple reports of racial profiling, suspiciously vague incident reports where evidence was lost or misfiled. None of the complaints had led to formal discipline. He had seen cases like this before, officers who knew exactly how to skirt accountability, protected by a system that gave them the benefit of the doubt every time. Not anymore. James picked up the phone, his voice hard as he spoke. "I want an internal review opened immediately. Both officers are suspended pending investigation. I also want a meeting with the precinct's senior staff by the end of the day. We're going to have a conversation about accountability." The other end of the line hesitated. "Sir, this is going to make waves." James's eyes darkened. "Good." By the afternoon, word had spread. The suspension of officers Blake and Turner had sent shockwaves through the department. Whispers echoed through the hallways, some officers glancing warily at one another, others shifting uncomfortably under the weight of unspoken truths. James stood at the front of the precinct briefing room, his presence commanding, his expression unreadable as the officers filed in. When the room was full, he finally spoke. What happened last night was unacceptable. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the room like a gunshot. 2 of our officers abused their authority. They made an unlawful stop, fabricated reasons to escalate the situation, and wrongfully detained a citizen. This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern, one that has been ignored for far too long. A few officers shifted, exchanging uneasy glances. Some remained stoic, waiting. Others, James noted, looked downright resentful. He had expected that. Not everyone in the department wanted change. Some thrived under the old system. "I won't tolerate it," James continued. "If you wear this badge, you will honor it. You will serve this community with integrity. If you can't do that, if you think you can hide behind the weight of this department to shield you from consequences, let me be clear. You are mistaken." The silence was heavy. He let it sit for a moment before delivering the final blow. This department is under review. Effective immediately, there will be mandatory bias training, stricter oversight on all stops and arrests, and an independent committee to review complaints of misconduct. And if you have a problem with that, you can turn in your badge now." His words hung in the air. No one moved. James nodded, satisfied, dismissed. As the officers filtered out, some murmuring, some quiet, James remained standing, watching them. He wasn't naive. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight. But today, a shift had begun, and that was enough to build on. Meanwhile, Alicia sat in her office, her phone buzzing with messages from colleagues, reporters, even former clients who had heard about her arrest. Some sent messages of support. Others asked if she was pressing charges. She wasn't sure how to answer that yet. A knock at her door made her look up. Her assistant poked her head in. "There's someone here to see you." Before Alicia could ask who, a young man stepped inside, hesitantly. He couldn't have been older than 20, his hands twisting together nervously. His eyes held a mix of admiration and uncertainty. "Ms. Carter," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say, what happened to you? It could have been me." He swallowed. "It has been me, more times than I can count. And I just wanted to say thank you for not letting it slide." Alicia felt something tighten in her chest. She offered him a small smile, standing to shake his hand. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "But you do have to keep speaking up. Keep fighting." He nodded, his grip firm. As he left, Alicia sat back down, staring at her phone again. A message from James popped up. "Dinner tonight? No distractions. Just us." She smiled, typing back. Looking forward to it. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But tonight, they had won something. And sometimes that was enough. A racist police officer assaulted a black teenager, but he had no idea that the teenager's mother was the one who would destroy his career. Layla Bennett stepped out of the clothing store in the mall, still clutching the small purse and the receipt she had just received at the checkout. She hadn't paid any attention to the scrutinizing gaze of the nearby police officer until a deep, authoritative voice boomed from behind. "Stop! Where do you think you're going?" Layla froze, turned around, and saw a tall white police officer with an imposing demeanor. His badge read, Derek Vaughn. She had never seen him before, yet in that moment, her instincts warned her that she was in trouble. "I just finished shopping. I'm on my way to meet a friend," Layla replied, trying to keep her voice calm. Vaughn narrowed his eyes and stepped closer. "I received a report that a young girl resembling you stole something from the store. Empty your purse." Layla was stunned. "I didn't steal anything. This is my receipt," she protested, holding the paper up as if to shield herself. But Vaughn was unmoved. He advanced even closer, his tone hardening. "Don't play games with me. I said empty your purse. Right now." Layla's heart raced. He wasn't even looking at the receipt. He had made up his mind. She knew all too well the type of person he was. Someone in power who believed he could instill fear, especially in someone like her. "I told you I didn't steal anything," Layla said, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. Vaughn smirked coldly. "That's the attitude of a little brat." And then, before Layla could react, a powerful punch from Vaughn landed squarely on her face. The pain hit her like a violent wave. Layla collapsed onto the hard tiled floor of the mall, her head slamming against the ground. She heard people around her screaming. Several quickly pulled out their phones to record the horrifying scene. The metallic taste of blood spread in her mouth. Inside a car parked outside the mall, Olivia Bennett received a call from an unknown number. When she answered, a panicked young girl's voice burst out. "Judge Bennett." Layla got beaten by the police. "You must come here immediately." Olivia's body froze for a moment. "What?" she nearly screamed. Without wasting another thought, Olivia turned the car around and sped straight to the mall. In that moment, her mind was consumed with one thought: my daughter. When Olivia stepped into the mall, she saw Layla sitting on the ground, her face swollen, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. Standing right in front of her daughter was Vaughn, his hand resting on his belt where his gun was holstered. A crowd gathered around, murmuring, with many people raising their phones to capture the scene. "Layla!" Olivia rushed toward her daughter, her eyes blazing with fury. Layla looked up, her eyes reflecting a mix of panic and humiliation. "Mom!" But before Olivia could reach her, Vaughn raised his hand to block her. "And who are you?" Olivia clenched her fists. "I am her mother, and I demand to know why you attacked my daughter." Vaughn smirked. "She resisted a search. I have every right to suspect and take appropriate measures." "Appropriate measures," Olivia growled, her eyes scanning Layla's battered face. "Is punching a 17-year-old girl your idea of appropriate measures?" Vaughn folded his arms defiantly. "You may file a complaint, but I did nothing wrong." Taking a deep breath, Olivia reached into her purse. When she pulled out her judge's badge and held it up before Vaughn, his expression shifted immediately. "I am Judge Olivia Bennett, and my daughter is no criminal, but I know one thing for certain. You are guilty." The tension in the air grew thicker than ever. Vaughn stammered, nervously scanning the crowd for support, yet no one spoke up. A few younger officers standing nearby appeared hesitant. I was just following protocol," Vaughn stuttered in defense. Olivia raised an eyebrow, her eyes icy. "Protocol? Do you have any idea how many people witnessed your abuse of power? How many phones recorded every moment? And I have the legal authority to ensure you won't get away with this." Amid the murmurs of the onlookers, Olivia looked down at her daughter. Layla was still trembling, but in her eyes, the fear had been replaced by determination. She understood that her mother wasn't just fighting for her, but for all those who had been treated unjustly. "I want you suspended immediately," Olivia declared, "and I will take this matter to court." For a moment, Vaughn looked visibly terrified. He knew he had messed with the wrong person, but Olivia was also well aware. This was only the beginning. If she wanted to change the system, the battle would be long and hard. Yet today she had secured a first victory, not just for Layla, but for justice. Olivia Bennett gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white as she drove faster than usual. Her mind was racing, the urgent phone call still echoing in her head. "The police hit Layla. You need to get here now." She could hardly believe it. Layla, her daughter, her kind, respectful, law-abiding daughter, was being assaulted by a police officer in the middle of a shopping mall. When Olivia's car screeched to a halt outside the mall, she wasted no time. She stormed inside, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. A large crowd had gathered in the center of the mall, beneath the harsh white lights. People stood in a circle, phones raised, capturing the chaos. And at the very center of it all was Layla, sitting on the ground, one hand clutching her swollen face, blood smeared on her lips. Standing in front of her was Derek Vaughn, the towering officer who had attacked her, his expression cold and devoid of remorse. "Layla," Olivia's voice rang out as she rushed toward her daughter. Layla lifted her head, her eyes filled with fear. But beneath the fear, there was something else. Humiliation. "Mom," she murmured, her voice trembling. Before Olivia could reach her, Vaughn stepped forward, raising a hand to stop her. "Who are you?" he demanded. Olivia inhaled deeply, forcing herself to stay composed even as rage burned inside her. "I am her mother, and I demand to know why you assaulted my daughter." Vaughn crossed his arms, smirking. "She resisted a security check. I have the right to detain and take appropriate action." Olivia narrowed her eyes. "Appropriate action? You punched a 17-year-old girl in the middle of a shopping mall and you call that appropriate?" Vaughn shrugged, his expression indifferent. "I followed protocol. If she hadn't resisted, this wouldn't have happened." A dangerous heat spread through Olivia's veins. She knew exactly who Vaughn was, the type of man who used his badge and authority to intimidate those who couldn't fight back, especially people of color. But this time, he had picked the wrong person. Without breaking eye contact, Olivia reached into her handbag and pulled out a sleek black leather case. With a swift, deliberate motion, she flipped it open and held it up for Vaughn to see. A judge's badge. The moment Vaughn's eyes landed on the words, Judge Olivia Bennett, His smirk vanished. "You just assaulted the daughter of a federal judge," Olivia said, her voice sharp as a blade. "And you think I'm gonna let this slide?" The air grew thick with tension. The crowd stirred, murmurs of anger rippling through them. Vaughn's confidence wavered as he glanced around, searching for backup. But none of his fellow officers came to his defense. Some of the younger officers looked unsure, shifting awkwardly in place. "This is assault on a minor. Do you know what the penalty for that is, Officer Vaughn?" Olivia continued, her gaze unrelenting. "I have dozens of witnesses, multiple videos capturing every second of your abuse of power. And if you think this system will protect you, you're sorely mistaken." A younger officer hesitated, then stepped forward. "Officer Vaughn, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Vaughn barked, but his voice had lost its edge. Layla, still in pain, watched her mother with newfound admiration. She had never seen her like this before. So strong, so fearless. Olivia bent down, gently helping her daughter to her feet. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Layla nodded weakly. "Yeah, but I don't think this is over." "No, you're right," Olivia said, her eyes flashing. She turned back to Vaughn. "I demand your immediate suspension." Vaughn clenched his jaw, his fists trembling with rage. But he didn't dare make another move. Olivia wasn't just an angry mother, she was a judge. Another officer of higher rank stepped forward. He looked from Vaughn to Olivia before clearing his throat. "Judge Bennett, we'll be reporting this incident to our superiors. Officer Vaughn will be placed on immediate suspension, pending an investigation." Olivia gave a cold, knowing smile. "Don't think suspension is enough. I will take this case to court." The words struck Vaughn like a hammer, shattering any illusion he had that he'd escape consequences. In the crowd, a woman whispered to her friend, "Finally, someone is standing up to them." A man nearby muttered, "He's been terrorizing people in this town for years. It's about time." The murmurs grew louder, transforming into calls for justice that filled them all. Olivia turned to Layla, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Layla still looked shaken, but deep in her eyes, there was a new light, hope. Because this time, they weren't staying silent. This time, they were fighting back. The fight for justice continued in a whirlwind of protests, legal battles, and media scrutiny. The video of Vaughn assaulting Layla had reached millions, igniting outrage far beyond their small town. People across the country were watching, waiting to see if justice would finally be served or if the system would once again protect one of its own. At City Hall, Olivia Bennett worked relentlessly, meeting with civil rights attorneys, lawmakers, and community leaders. She understood that this fight was about more than just Vaughn. It was about dismantling a system that had shielded officers like him for far too long. Meanwhile, the smear campaign against her and Layla escalated. Conservative news networks framed Olivia as waging a personal vendetta against law enforcement. Anonymous social media accounts spread false claims that Layla had been shoplifting and had resisted arrest, easily debunked, yet still feeding the cycle of misinformation. But the attacks only fueled the movement. Protests grew into the tens of thousands, with high-profile activists and celebrities lending their voices. The Department of Justice launched an independent investigation into the police department, and demands for systemic reform echoed from the streets to the highest levels of government. One evening, as Olivia prepared for another press conference, an anonymous email arrived. Attached was a trove of internal police records, disciplinary reports, suppressed complaints, and damning evidence of corruption. At the center of it all was Vaughn, with a history of excessive force spanning more than a decade. The next morning, the Washington Post broke the story. Whistleblower leaks police misconduct files. Derek Vaughn was shielded. Despite years of brutality, the revelation sent shockwaves through the country. Vaughn, once an untouchable figure with the power of his badge, now stood fully exposed. Public pressure surged, and within days, the district attorney had no choice but to press charges. The trial was set. The world was watching. The courtroom overflowed with people on the first day. News cameras filled the halls, protesters chanted outside, and Vaughn sat at the defense table, his once arrogant demeanor replaced with unease. Across the room, Olivia and Layla sat side by side, their presence a symbol of the fight for justice. The prosecution delivered a devastating case, 12 separate complaints of excessive force, all dismissed without consequence. Body cam footage mysteriously malfunctioning in cases involving black civilians. Internal memos proving higher-ups had protected Vaughn despite clear misconduct. But the most powerful testimony came from Layla. She stood at the witness stand, her voice unwavering as she recounted the fear, the pain, the humiliation, not just for herself, but for every victim of police violence who had been silenced. By the time she stepped down, even members of the jury looked visibly shaken. After weeks of testimony, deliberation was swift, guilty. The word crashed through the courtroom like thunder. Vaughn was convicted on multiple counts, including aggravated assault and official misconduct. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison, a rare but significant victory in a country where officers were almost never held accountable. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers. Olivia and Layla stepped out of the courthouse, greeted by thousands chanting their names. But Olivia knew this fight wasn't over. Months later, the reforms Olivia had fought for were beginning to take shape. A civilian oversight board was established to investigate police misconduct. Mandatory de-escalation training became law. The Vaughn Act was passed, ensuring that officers with histories of excessive force could no longer be shielded by the system. One evening, as Layla sat by the window, watching another protest march through the streets, she turned to her mother. "Do you think we really changed anything?" Olivia placed a firm hand on her daughter's shoulder, her expression resolute. "We didn't just change something, Layla. We started something. If the fight wasn't over. But this time the system was afraid of them. The trial of Officer Derek Vaughn became the focal point of the entire town. One by one, people who had suffered under his abuse came forward, filing complaints and demanding justice. But Olivia Bennett knew this fight wouldn't be easy. Vaughn was facing charges for assaulting a minor, but he wasn't alone. The system that had protected him for years was now working to shield him once again. The police department issued a statement claiming that Vaughn had acted instinctively, with no intent to cause harm, and that he had simply followed protocol. The police union hired a team of high-powered lawyers to defend him, crafting a carefully constructed narrative to justify his actions, but Olivia remained steadfast. She had prepared for this battle. At the first court hearing, Vaughn's lawyers immediately attempted to shift the blame onto Layla. The defendant was simply following standard procedure to prevent shoplifting, Vaughn's attorney argued. While it is unfortunate that the young woman was injured, there is no evidence that my client intended to harm her. Olivia clenched her fists. No intent to harm? She turned to Layla, whose face still bore faint bruises but whose eyes no longer held fear. When Olivia stood to speak, she wasn't just advocating for her daughter, she was speaking for the hundreds of victims who had been silenced by officers like Vaughn. No one can call this a normal response, Olivia declared. No one can justify a police officer punching a 17-year-old girl in the face, especially when she had done nothing wrong. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecution played the video footage. The images were damning. Vaughn, his fist slamming into Layla's face, her body crumpling to the ground. There was no room for denial. After 3 weeks of intense legal battles, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty. In that moment, Olivia knew they had won. But she also understood. This was just the beginning. Just days after Vaughn's conviction, the system began fighting back. The police department was divided. Some officers supported reform, while others wanted to protect men like Vaughn. Mayor James Calloway summoned Olivia to his office. When she walked in, he let out a weary sigh. "You won," he said. "But you know what comes next, don't you?" Olivia sat down, crossing her arms. "They're going to try to push me out. They'll fabricate stories about me, they'll threaten me. Calloway nodded. And they won't stop. The very next day, the smear campaign began. Headlines flooded conservative news outlets. Judge Bennett destabilizing law enforcement. Justice or revenge. Was Layla Bennett really innocent? On social media, anonymous accounts spread Olivia's personal information, sending her and her family death threats. One late night, as Olivia was working in her office, Layla walked in, holding her phone, her face pale with concern. "Mom, have you seen this?" Olivia took the phone and stared at the screen. A photo of her had been posted with a chilling caption beneath it. "Stop now, or someone will pay the price." Layla's voice wavered. "Are you scared?" Olivia inhaled deeply. "Yes." Layla gripped her mother's hand tightly. "But you're not stopping, are you?" Olivia met her daughter's gaze. "Nothing in this world could make me stop." As false narratives about Olivia spread, the people of the town rose to defend her. Protests erupted outside City Hall and the police department bigger than ever before. Crowds held up signs, "We stand for justice." Justice for all, not just Layla. Hold violent cops accountable. Civil rights organizations stepped in. Lawyers, journalists, and activists began digging deeper into Vaughn's past, uncovering a disturbing truth. Vaughn wasn't the only one. A leaked police report revealed a network of officers with histories of excessive force, all of whom had been shielded by the department. Then the federal government stepped in. An official investigation was launched into the entire police force. The system was beginning to crack. One early morning, Olivia stood at her office window, looking down at the streets below. Hundreds of people were still marching, their voices demanding change. Layla stepped beside her, the faint bruise on her cheek a fading reminder of what had started it all. But this time, her smile was bright. "We really did something, didn't we?" she asked. Olivia smiled, her eyes filled with determination. "We've only just begun, my love." On her desk, a new stack of case files awaited her. More victims, more families, more battles to be fought. Fighting the system would never be easy. But if someone had to do it, it would be her, not just for Layla, not just for this one case, but for every voice that had never been heard. It starts like any other day until it doesn't. A black woman walks into a courthouse, calm, composed, and completely unaware that she's about to be humiliated by the very people sworn to uphold the law. They think she's just another face, another body in the system. They strip her dignity, laugh while doing it, and think they'll walk away clean. But what they don't know is this: they picked the wrong woman. Because she's not just another citizen. She's the one person who holds the power to bring it all crashing down, legally, publicly, permanently. What follows is a storm, a reckoning, and a courtroom twist they never saw coming. It was just after 8 a.m. when Marilyn Carter stepped out of her steel-gray Honda Accord and walked up the steps of the Thomas P. O'Neill Federal Building in Boston. The morning light bounced off the brick and glass facade, casting long lines across the sidewalk. She took a breath, smoothed the front of her soft ivory blouse, and clutched a slim leather portfolio in one hand. Her heels tapped quietly, each step a signal of confidence earned, not borrowed. Marilyn didn't wear her robe outside the courtroom. Never had. She believed in walking into spaces first as a citizen, eyes open, head held high, no symbols of authority to shield her. But that morning, no one greeted her as "Your Honor." No nods, no recognition. Just another black woman in a federal building where power had long worn the wrong face. As she stepped toward the metal detectors, the energy shifted. Officer Carl Dobbs, a longtime courthouse security guard, spotted her. Ex-military, flat-top haircut, late 50s. A belly full of coffee and a head full of certainty. He didn't blink, didn't smile. Just narrowed his eyes and raised a hand. "Ma'am," he barked, "I'm gonna need you to step over here." Marilyn paused. "Is there a problem?" Dobbs took a slow, heavy breath. "We've had issues with contraband recently," he said. "Gonna need to run a secondary check." Marilyn tilted her head slightly. You saw my badge? I saw a woman walking in here without proper clearance, he said. That's all I need to see. Calmly, she pulled her credentials from her bag and held them up. The badge glinted beneath the overhead light. Federal Judge, First Circuit. He took it from her hand but didn't read it, just slid it into his breast pocket like a receipt. Follow me. Before she could respond, he turned and marched down a side hallway. She followed, jaw tight. He led her to a room off the main corridor, cold, plain, fluorescent lit. A folding table sat near the wall. A single surveillance camera blinked in the corner. There was a chair, a metal detector wand, and something else. Scissors. Large ones. She didn't like the look of them. Take off your jacket, Dobbs ordered. No, Marilyn said evenly. You have no legal cause to detain me, and that badge you just pocketed confirms it. He didn't flinch. Then I'll help you out. Before she could move, he grabbed the collar of her blouse. The blouse her late mother had given her the day she was confirmed to the bench. And with one swift, jagged pull, cut straight down the front. Buttons popped, threads split. Her shirt hung open, her undershirt exposed. Her breath caught, but she didn't cry out. Behind Dobbs, a young female officer stood, horrified. She didn't speak, just froze. Dobbs dropped the shredded fabric to the floor and smirked. Looks like you're clear. Marilyn's voice was steel. You just assaulted a federal judge. He laughed. Sure I did. She reached for her ID on his desk without asking and turned to leave. He didn't stop her. Just leaned against the table like nothing had happened. Courtroom's that way, he said, chuckling. She walked out, what was left of her blouse barely held together by a single button. People passed her. Some glanced. Others avoided eye contact. She didn't break stride. When she entered her chambers, the silence felt thicker than air. Her judicial robe lay over the back of her chair, perfectly folded. She didn't wait for an assistant. Didn't call security. Didn't cry. She slipped the robe on, slowly, precisely, like armor. Then picked up the docket and headed back into the hallway. Down the corridor, the doors to courtroom 4B loomed. Inside, it was standing room only, a major hearing involving allegations of police brutality during the Boston Freedom March the previous year had drawn press, activists, and half the city's legal elite. The expectation was that the judge would enter from the side door, robed, unshaken. But that morning, Marilyn Carter pushed through the main double doors, walking in front of 100 sets of eyes with the collar of her blouse torn and a story written in every line of her face. It didn't take long for the whispers to spread. She wasn't a visitor, she wasn't a victim. She was the judge. And she was about to change everything. The courtroom didn't breathe. Marilyn Carter's heels echoed against the polished floor as she walked past rows of attorneys, plaintiffs, reporters, and law clerks, each of whom had gone silent at the sight of her. She made no announcement, offered no explanation. She simply walked to the bench, past the stunned faces, past the rustling papers that stilled mid-motion, past Officer Dobbs himself, who stood frozen at the side door, a clipboard in one hand and the weight of dawning dread in the other. Her robe swayed slightly as she turned to face the room. Her blouse beneath remained visible, cut, frayed, violated. Her face, however, remained unreadable, calm not from serenity, but from calculation. She picked up the gavel and tapped it once. Court is now in session. A wave of stiffened spines and a collective inhale swept the room. Everyone, even those who hadn't understood what they were witnessing, now knew they were watching something that would be remembered. The first case was called United States v. Lowell Police Department. The charges were heavy, excessive force, unlawful arrest, intimidation, and systemic abuse during last year's protest at Government Center. A group of officers stood at the defense table, stoic in tailored suits, eyes flicking toward the judge with wary confusion. They had seen her enter, seen the torn shirt beneath the robe, but the magnitude hadn't fully registered. Yet. Marilyn's voice never wavered as she acknowledged the parties and allowed the prosecutor to begin. Witnesses took the stand. A black college student described being pinned face down on the pavement for chanting. A war veteran, hands trembling, testified how he had been shoved to the ground trying to shield his daughter. One after another, their voices echoed in the courtroom like thunder. Throughout it all, Officer Dobbs remained still. When Marilyn glanced his way, briefly, his mouth parted but no words came. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her attention snapped back to the witness stand. Her pen moved steadily, each note crisp and precise. When the first recess was called, the gallery erupted, not in volume but in realization. Reporters pulled out phones, whispering rapidly, some typing faster than they could think. It didn't take long before headlines hit Twitter. Judge Carter appears to be assault victim. Presides over police misconduct trial in torn blouse. Inside the courtroom, murmurs grew. Staff whispered in corners. A bailiff brushed past Dobbs without a word. He was no longer untouchable. The crack had formed. And Marilyn? She remained behind the bench, unmoved. 15 minutes later, court resumed. The second witness, a young Latino EMT, spoke with conviction. He had tried to assist a protester gasping for breath, only to be shoved by an officer and threatened with arrest for obstruction. They didn't want help, he said. They wanted obedience. Marilyn nodded slowly, not just as a judge but as someone who understood what it meant to be silenced. She asked questions then, her voice sharp, her tone deliberate. And was this standard practice, threatening medics? The EMT hesitated. Not officially. She raised an eyebrow. But unofficially. He exhaled. Yes, ma'am. She let the silence hang, then turned back to the prosecution. Continue. By mid-morning, the courthouse was no longer just a courthouse. It was a crucible. Outside, cameras had begun to gather. Inside, the air was heavy with the weight of something unspoken, but undeniable. The robe no longer disguised the truth. And when Marilyn finally called another recess, the room remained half-seated, unsure whether to stand, speak, or simply absorb what was happening. That's when she called his name. Officer Carl Dobbs, step forward. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Dobbs hesitated, his hand tightening around the clipboard. Your Honor, he stammered. Now, she said with finality. He stepped into the center of the courtroom, eyes darting. State your name for the record. Carl Dobbs. Length of service in this courthouse? 18 years. She tapped her pen twice. And in those 18 years, how many women have you subjected to illegal searches? He blinked. Your Honor, Answer the question. None. That is incorrect, she said coldly. Because this morning, in that screening room, without cause or authority, you cut open the blouse of a federal judge. Me. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. You did not ask my name. You did not verify my ID. You violated protocol, policy, and the law. And you did it without hesitation. Dobbs opened his mouth. Nothing came out. How many complaints have been filed against you? I don't know. I do. 11 formal, all dismissed. And how many of those were buried? Dobbs didn't respond. Marilyn stood slowly, her hands on the bench, robe draping down her arms like a battle flag. Because of you and those like you, this building, a place meant to embody justice, has become a theater of intimidation. She turned to the attending officers. Escort Mr. Dobbs into custody. Do not place him in general population. Charges to follow. The two officers moved forward. Wait, please. Wait, Dobbs called out. But it was too late. The courtroom watched as the man who had once stood guard now walked in chains. There was no applause, only silence. Deep, respectful, awestruck. When Marilyn sat down again, it was with the kind of authority no robe alone could grant. She turned to the clerk. Is the docket ready? Yes, Your Honor. Then we will proceed. The next witness brought the courtroom to another edge of pain. A local teacher, early 40s, described watching her students get thrown to the ground during a peaceful march. I tried to speak, she said. But when I did, I was handcuffed. Right in front of my class. Her voice broke. My students, they stopped believing in justice that day. Marilyn leaned forward. And do you believe in it now? Today, the teacher asked, looking directly at her. I think I'm starting to. The judge didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened, just for a second. Outside the courtroom, the news had spread like wildfire. Judge Carter orders arrest of courthouse officer mid-trial flashed across CNN. By noon, protesters had gathered in the square. Signs were held high. Protect black women. Stop the silence. The bench speaks. But Marilyn Carter hadn't done this for headlines. She hadn't spoken to the press. She had simply done her job, and finally, the world had decided to watch. As the lunch recess ended, Marilyn remained in chambers, quiet. A folder lay before her, sealed, confidential, left by the administrative officer. Inside, documents, complaints, emails, signatures, 11 prior grievances against Officer Dobbs, each marked unsubstantiated or no action required. All signed by the same name, Judge Lionel Ford, her former mentor, the man who once told her she was too emotional for the bench. She stared at his signature, again and again, then flipped to the last page. A memo, handwritten. Dobbs may be aggressive, but he keeps certain people in line. Let him be. Marilyn didn't cry, didn't shout. She just closed the folder and stood. The courtroom filled once more. And this time, the energy had changed. No longer just a trial, no longer just testimony. This was transformation. And Marilyn Carter, scarred, unshaken, undeniable, was leading it. By the time Judge Marilyn Carter returned to the bench, the courtroom wasn't the same space it had been that morning. The gallery stood not just out of tradition, but out of something deeper, respect earned in real time. She didn't wait for the clerk to announce her. She simply walked in, her robe trailing like a shadow of what had been stripped from her just hours earlier, and took her seat, as if the chair had always been hers, because it had. The air was still, charged, reverent. Marilyn tapped the gavel once, and every conversation died mid-sentence. The prosecution rose to call their next witness, a man in his late 60s named Reverend Elijah Booker, a civil rights icon in Massachusetts and longtime community advocate. He walked slowly, aided by a cane, but his voice held no tremor. Your Honor, I've waited 30 years to testify in a courtroom that finally felt like one, he said. He detailed years of harassment during peaceful gatherings, always dismissed as procedural misunderstandings, always buried under claims of security necessity. He had filed complaints. He had been ignored. And now, he said, turning to Marilyn directly, you've reminded them what justice looks like in flesh and blood. She nodded once, silently, and let his words settle like dust over stone. The defense attorneys had grown increasingly uncomfortable, whispering, huddling, exchanging glances with their clients. One finally stood and approached the bench. Your Honor, we request a recess to discuss a motion to consider judicial recusal based on perceived conflict of interest. Marilyn leaned forward slowly. You're suggesting I'm unfit to oversee a case involving systemic abuse by law enforcement because I, a federal judge, was just subjected to systemic abuse by law enforcement. The attorney shifted, eyes flickering. We simply want to preserve the integrity of the court. You mean the appearance of integrity, she said sharply. The same integrity this court lost when you defended officers like Dobbs for decades. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Request denied. Motion may be filed, but it will not stall this proceeding. You may sit down. Her tone was like flint. The attorney did as instructed. The gallery didn't cheer, they didn't need to. The power in the room had already shifted, and everyone knew it. More testimony followed, each voice more piercing than the last. A social worker, a former bailiff, a teenage girl who had been pepper-sprayed during a peaceful sit-in, her voice barely rising above a whisper but clear as glass. Marilyn remained composed, present, absorbing it all not just as a judge, but as a witness herself. And in the quiet breaks between testimonies, the weight of what had long been silenced became impossible to ignore. Mid-afternoon, a clerk entered with a sealed envelope. Marilyn opened it, eyes scanning the contents. A letter from the Department of Justice. They were launching a full investigation into the courthouse staff based on reports and public footage of the morning's incident. Beneath it, another page, an official notice that Judge Lionel Ford had submitted his resignation, citing health concerns. She said nothing aloud, but folded the documents carefully, then looked up at the packed courtroom and made a decision. We are entering into the record all formal complaints previously filed against Officer Carl Dobbs, she announced. These include internal emails, supervisory signatures, and the names of those who facilitated their dismissal. A defense attorney began to rise in objection. She held up a hand. Sit down. He froze. Let the record show that this court is no longer in the business of protecting predators or suppressing victims. Let the record show that silence is no longer neutrality, it is complicity. The courtroom was silent, even the reporters had stopped typing. No one wanted to miss a word. The justice system will never be perfect, she said, but from this moment forward in this courtroom, it will be present. In the final hour of proceedings, Marilyn introduced a new policy proposal. Mandatory anti-bias training for all courthouse personnel, psychological evaluations every 2 years, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. This is called the Carter Protocol, she said, and I will take it to the circuit, to Congress, and beyond. Because what happened to me should never have happened to anyone, and it will never happen again. Not in this house. Heads nodded slowly throughout the room. A few hands gripped armrests. A tear rolled down the cheek of a woman in the second row who had once filed a complaint that was never returned. When Marilyn looked at her, she smiled for the first time that day, small but real. Then came the sentencing. Officer Dobbs, now stripped of badge and belt, was led into the courtroom in cuffs, his face pale, his eyes sunken. He stood before the bench, unable to meet her gaze. Marilyn stared at him, not with vengeance, but with clarity. Carl Dobbs, she said, this court finds you guilty of abuse of power, violation of civil rights, obstruction of justice, and unlawful use of force against a federal officer. The room didn't move. You are hereby sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, without parole. You will be processed immediately. And for the record, your behavior is not an anomaly. It is the product of a system that chose silence over accountability. That system begins to end today. Dobbs didn't speak. He didn't even look up. He was escorted out as quietly as he had come in. There was no celebration, no clapping, just reverent stillness, the kind that follows something irreversible. Marilyn removed her robe slowly, folded it over her arm, and stepped down from the bench. She didn't return to chambers. She walked straight to the doors, past her staff, past the reporters, and into the afternoon sun. Outside, the crowd had grown. Protesters, students, community elders, all gathered in the square. When she stepped onto the courthouse steps, they didn't cheer. They stood, a collective breath, a moment of recognition. A young woman approached her quietly and extended a piece of paper, a handwritten list of names, each one a person who had suffered in silence for years. "They're ready to testify now," she said. Marilyn nodded and took it gently. That night, Marilyn returned home and stood before her bathroom mirror. The blouse was gone, her shoulders bare. The day had left marks, not on her body, but on her soul. Her reflection didn't show weakness. It showed survival. Her phone buzzed. A text from a clerk. "They're calling you the judge who didn't flinch." She smiled, but only briefly. She wasn't looking for titles. She was looking for change. In the weeks that followed, the Carter Protocol was adopted in 2 other districts. A congressional committee requested her testimony. And at a middle school in Dorchester, students put up a bulletin board that read, "Be like Judge Carter." One day during a civics lesson, a student raised her hand and asked, "Is justice a place?" The teacher paused, then answered, "No. But sometimes, a person can make it feel like one." Months later, the headlines would fade. But in one federal building in Boston, a robe still hung on the back of a chair, not as a shield, but as a reminder. A reminder that power is not in the symbols we wear, but in the truth we stand for. And Marilyn Carter? She didn't set out to become a symbol. She set out to do her job. And in doing so, she changed what the job meant. She walked those courthouse halls not louder, not faster, but fuller, with the weight of every voice that had been silenced now walking with her. And when the next hearing began and she stepped into the courtroom, everyone stood. Not because the clerk said so, but because they knew. Justice had arrived. And this time, it looked exactly as it should.